Hi, and welcome. I'm Vinnie Strumolo, CEO and Chief Clinical Officer at Resolutions Healthcare. I spent decades in the mental health treatment industry, specializing in trauma. The topics and your stories are what we will discuss on this podcast, so let's start the conversation. Last week, we discussed what a traumatic event is. This week, we want to discuss what does trauma resolution look like. So, Travis, we read the blog on what does trauma resolution look like, and let's open and start that conversation.
Last time we met, we discussed what a traumatic event looks like, and we kind of dabbled in what is an unresolved trauma? How do you know what that is? Can you give us some more clarity as to what an unresolved trauma looks like?
Okay, so to recap, we defined all the traumatic events, and those traumatic events that go unresolved would lead to symptoms that may arise immediately, days, months, years later. Symptoms come up, and what we do is we resort to drugs and alcohol, gambling, um, all kinds of unhealthy ways to deal with those symptoms. So we discussed then kind of plugging in what a healthy ground would look like going to treatment, recovery groups, getting sober. And that would maintain while you do the discovery to be able to resolve your trauma.
So, through reading the blog, there were a couple of mentions of the word band aid. So, I experience a traumatic event. I'm able to resolve that traumatic event by some outside source. And that's misplaced, correct?
Let me back it up then. The traumatic event occurs, unresolved will lead to the symptoms. Again, may lead you to drugs and alcohol. Okay, so you enter treatment, and we kind of take those unhealthy ways to deal with all those symptoms and we plug in some healthy ways to deal with it. But does that resolve the trauma? No. It just makes you feel better without having to use unhealthy ways to feel better. But now the internal work begins on trying to resolve that. So what are we trying to resolve? You look back on a traumatic event. You look at that event, what you believe about that event. We can't change the event. An event happens, we can't change our past, but we can change the way we look at it and what we believe about it. Okay, so that we can't get into that discussion because that's another podcast. But overall, the fact is we're plugging in a healthier way for you to handle your symptoms while you work to resolve the trauma. So fast forward, when is it resolved? Okay. Sometimes you may feel better. The healthy ground is working. You start to believe, well, wait a minute. I went to treatment. I went to rehab. I went to therapy. I'm feeling better. Um, Maybe it's gone. Maybe it's resolved. Well, maybe not. But how do you know for sure? So what we preach at Resolutions and in the treatment center is that the healthy grounds are band-aids. We slap a band-aid on something, it's not the fix, it's a band-aid. But then again, how long can that band-aid hold? I've seen it go from days to 23 years of band-aid. And then suddenly the trauma and the symptoms are back. So what's going on? So to use the example that I use in my talk and usually helps clients understand is I go to relationships. How often we're suffering from a traumatic event, memory. Okay, we're going out. We don't want to be alone. We're constantly going out. Suddenly we meet someone and we fall in love. All of a sudden, we feel great. Symptoms are gone. Everything's gone. It must be better. And you continue that relationship. I've seen it happen up to 23 years. You get married, have children. Everything's fine until it's not. Because what happened was an outside force made you feel good. Symptoms went away. Trauma went away. But emotionally, you're still stuck back in the trauma. So what happens? You're moving along. How come 23 years later, I get someone in my treatment group that's back to using suddenly? What do you think happened?
They're the kids left home or
Divorce.
right, yes.
Divorce. All of a sudden, divorce. All of a sudden, children leave. Well, now you're back to being alone. Well, remember, unresolved trauma, alone time is deadly. In fact, there's a blog I have on the website just about alone time. Um, and that's a big test on whether you resolve something or not, because when you're alone is when your mind starts going over stuff again. So now you've had another traumatic event, a divorce, set you back 23 years to where you were when you started. As opposed to, let's go back, traumatic event occurred, you went to treatment, now you continue therapy, okay, and through therapy, started feeling better about yourself, symptoms start fading, and you're comfortable being alone. Basically, on the website, if you look at that blog, you'll see I used a picture of someone's feet up, and it looks like a Colorado feet up with a Colorado background, because that's how it feels when you resolve it. How do I know? Because I use my own example of that. So that's how you know that knot in your stomach that came back immediately with the divorce wouldn't come back if the trauma was resolved. You'd be able to handle the future events that we talked about last time on the podcast on what is a traumatic event. And if you deal with it and you do resolve it, future traumatic events, you're going to be able to absorb them because you're in a healthier place.
So a lot of treatment centers don't, and this necessarily isn't in the blog, but I think that this is important. A lot of treatment centers, 30-day programs, don't touch trauma. And I would like you to explain that, right? Because, any client that comes in, right, they want to leave the treatment center in somewhat and repair to some degree, right? But then you arrive and you're being told, hey, like we're gonna deal with the individual, but we're not gonna touch trauma. Why is that?
And I wrote, in fact, one of my blogs covers that also. I haven't ever been able to resolve someone's severe trauma in 30 days out of rehab. So they are smart to say that. I've seen that all the time. They say, well, how can you take on trauma? Well, I don't take on trauma to resolve it. In the rehab, you're there 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. I have to get you sober first. You can't deal with the mental health component, that traumatic event, if you're not sober. But that doesn't mean I can't take on the topic of trauma. And again, going back to our last podcast, in resolution focused therapy, my paradigm, I lay it out in the overview. Yeah, if you remember, traumatic event, symptoms develop, you run to unhealthy ways like drugs and alcohol. We plug in healthier ways, writing, exercise, meditation, yoga, all kinds of wellness things to replace you having to run to the drug and alcohol. Okay, so now that we're teaching you, put the band aid on so that you don't go back to using when you leave my center. Now, if I don't address that, okay, so I take you 30 days out of your environment. Yeah, I put you on our beautiful ranch. You spend 30 days, you get through it, and you feel like you're ready to take on the world. But then you're going back to your environment. That's not an easy thing to do. If I don't cover trauma at all I've done now is clean you out from drugs and alcohol. I gave you some tools. We talked about recovery. You went in recovery groups, they're great. Recovery programs, but I haven't touched. We'll put you there in the first place if you're there because of an unresolved trauma. Let me say it that way, because I'm not making that assumption 100%. So the point is, not touching it is leaving the wound open. And it's just a matter of when you're going back home. By teaching you that that wound is there, I'm putting a band aid on, I'm telling you it's a band aid, and that you need to follow up and you need to work on resolving trauma. My own events in my life took me 4 years. Now I get it. You get it. We're in the substance world. Someone, a substance abuser comes to help. Well, let me go back. When you were using, how fast did you need to get that fixed? Right. Well, that thinking is still there. So you want to fix that fast. How many clients at our center, out of 4,500 clients, probably 99% wanted to do 30 days, go home, and they're ready to take on the world. Well, it doesn't work like that. We know that. With trauma, if it's severe, now why do I keep saying that? Because traumatic events are all different levels of trauma. I can give you a quick example. Someone's living, your life's been pretty good. You never went for therapy. You're not a drug and alcohol user. Suddenly you're in the middle of a hurricane or a tornado or a natural disaster. And it truly terrorizes you and your family for hours and hours. And it kind of throws you off, gives you some fears. So you go for therapy. I could probably meet with you for a couple of hours and we're fine. Versus, versus, I've had childhood abuse or was part of violence or domestic violence, or I was victimized, more so on the severe level, war. They take time. It's going to take time. So again, I need to educate you that it can't be resolved in 30, 60, 90 days. Don't look at it in a counting your days like sobriety. It's infinite. It's your journey till you die should be to feel better about life and yourself. That should be everybody's journey. Okay, so now you have that and you move forward. But how do you really know 5 years down the road? You did your work, you're doing your things, but let's just say you avoided the things that triggered your memories and you think you're resolved. And that's the tough part. When do you face that again? You'll know. So, how can I describe it? I can only use my own experience and say when I had my own traumatic event, people can relate to feeling a knot in your stomach all the time, waking up with feeling hopeless, helpless, depressed, anxious. You don't really want to go on with your day, or life is tough and you keep getting triggered to go back and you keep getting flashbacks, you have nightmares. These are things that you're going to look for to be gone with resolution. But like I said, it could take on a kind of it can kind of trick you. So how do you know you really did it? Well, you're going to be always, I call them residual effects of trauma. I see flashing lights, I still get triggered. I go back 30 something years. Difference is in the past when I was unresolved, I would flash back. So if you're experiencing in the present, you experience a flashback, you go back to that event, but you don't come back for hours or days, as opposed to someone who resolved it will go back, have the memory, will not emotionally react to it, and be able to come back to the present within minutes. So the experience is there, the memory is there. Now that weakness now becomes my strength.
So you brought up that somebody could put a band-aid on for somewhat of 23 years, right? So what does that look like? Why is that a thing?
Yeah, it's the most actually bizarre thing I've ever seen. And when I first saw that was when I worked actually with children 25 years ago. I noticed after you work for years and years, and then as I was developing the resolution focused therapy, I'm watching, and back at that time when you're treating someone for years, you kind of get a good feel for what's happening, and watching someone kind of replay their past event. They're replaying it, and when they get the flashback, immediately emotionally they regress. They go back. To give you an example, 6.5-year-old, severe trauma, suddenly gets a flashback in their environment. And this is, again, a case that I worked with. Suddenly gets an event and goes, suddenly I get a call, and this person falls to the floor, this girl, and she can't walk anymore, starts crawling, can't talk anymore. And I think, and the reason why I'm bringing this case up is because this is what started me on where I'm gonna take it to. So what's going on? Me as a therapist, I'm wondering what's going on here. Well, fast forward months of working and watching and observing, it made sense to me when I read the history. The abuse occurred with her during her 6 month to year age. Well, you're not walking yet, are you? And you're not talking yet at 6 months old. So what happens is this triggered her back. And it's like, okay, so emotionally, she's 6.5 years old. But when you get triggered, the emotional age goes back to where the abuse occurred. So for us, talking about adults in treatment, in my group, you may have heard this. That's why I would tell everybody, what's your emotional age? I would look on your timeline. I'm looking for the first event in your timeline that was if you have a traumatic event, looking for that first one. First unresolved traumatic event will kind of mark your emotional age. So let's take the example of the 23-year case. This woman at 12 or 13, okay, is sexually abused, immediately starts suffering from PTSD, and immediately starts getting into trouble at school, sexualized behaviors, a lot of problems. By 17 is out partying. By 18 in clubs, drinking, drugging. At 21, suddenly everything stops. So remember what we talked about. Everything stops without her going anywhere, without her getting treatment, without her getting therapy, without her going to a rehab. She's suddenly okay. The world is at peace in her head. Well, she fell in love. She's in a relationship now. Takes the attention away from her having to deal with her internal. So we fast forward over that 23 years, has 2 children. Okay, everything seems to be going fine. Reach 40, whatever the math is there, 20 to 43, divorce, kids moved out. Emotionally, she didn't resolve her trauma. She didn't do anything to resolve it. So emotionally, she immediately resorts back to what age? Of 13. And exactly that's how she starts striking out again, drinking, drugging, partying. And that's so from my early years working with trauma and following it through to adults and working with adults, I realized your emotional age is frozen from that first traumatic event. So another sign of trauma resolution will be when you're triggered, you do not resort to emotional reactivity or an earlier emotional age. And I felt that with anger. I used to get angry pretty fast and emotionally reactive, probably through high school, quick to get angry and, pound the chest and do all these things, and things happen. As I progressed through my life and I did my work in my 30s, and one day I'm realizing, what happened? Why don't I get triggered anymore? Why don't I feel like, getting angry that I feel like I'm going to blow up because, again, I'm at peace with the things that used to kind of stir everything up. So I don't know if that makes sense with what resolution would look like, but you have to be able to take toll. Now, if she did the work, if that case we used, if she did the work, the mental health work along those 23 years, what would it look like with resolution? In her 40s, she would get the divorce. She'd be sad, depressed, maybe 6 months, a year, but she'd be able to stay in that age, absorb it, process it, and move on with her life. So that's what resolution would look like, as opposed to her resorting back to her 12, 13-year-old trauma.
So trauma resolution is directly affiliated or associated with emotional maturity.
That kind of makes sense
So
to say it that way. Yeah.
the reason why I because so many times working in treatment, you see so many people sadly come back to treatment and they're like, why can't I get this? Right. Like, I know that my emotional maturity is not where it needs to be because situation happens and I go right back to the same situation that I was in prior to getting sober. So by what you're saying is that without what basically this person, more without knowing exactly what they're going through, more than likely this person has suffered a traumatic event and not found resolution for that event.
I would say so. I would look at their timeline. Their timeline would reveal it to me. But, it's emotional reactivity is a big one. I'm going through the cases I've worked with, but even working with someone recently. Emotional reactivity. Let me go to another example of relationship. Since we've all been in relationships, correct? All right, everyone's in a relationship. Starts out wonderful, love, no, everything's wonderful, everything feels great. Let's say it goes a couple of years, but this relationship isn't going to make it. It's starting to have trouble, problems, whatever the reasons. You start getting feelings inside. You know what? Just don't feel the same way anymore. But push it aside, push it down, because you've been together a couple of years. You kind of push it away. I'm going to try to make it work. Trying to force it to make it work. Okay, that might work for a month, 2 months, maybe even 3 months, maybe 4 months. You're stuffing. You're not dealing with the emotion, the feelings you're having. You're afraid to discuss it with your partner. So you hold it in. Suddenly you're driving in a car. You don't know where you're going with your partner, and you're trying to get directions, and you say turn right, but I wasn't listening and I turned left, and suddenly you chop their head off. Ever been there where you suddenly emotionally react to somebody that's way over? All I did was make a wrong turn. I could just turn around and go the other way. It's not a big deal, but yet you exploded. That ever happened? Well, that explosion is what? What is it?
Lack of emotional maturity, or it's
No, well, yes, but it's holding in
okay.
the trauma. And again, looking at breakups, they can be traumatic. Divorces can be traumatic. You have 10, 15, 20 years invested, a home. There's financial responsibilities, children, all this stuff going on. It's not so easy to listen to a voice in your head that's saying, you know what? I'm not too happy in this relationship anymore. So I'm using that as a subtle example, but because I know everybody can relate to when you've exploded at your loved one over something that was kind of ridiculous to be that angry about. That anger isn't over that event. The anger is over you pushing down, maybe feeling guilty. You're ashamed of the fact that you've lost, you're not in love with them anymore, but you're not going to be able to tell them that. So you see, these kind of things are what happens with traumatic events, the emotion kind of breaks off. You can't deal with it. It's too much to deal with. So unresolved, the event occurs, too overwhelming. I can't deal with it. My emotion breaks off. Okay, stuck. Now I'm stuck. But I'm living my life, still chronologically aging, but I'm kind of stuck because I've removed myself from my emotion. But every time something raw happens or something trigger happens, that 12, 13-year-old or wherever you're stuck comes out. That explosion comes out. So these are the little subtle signs that will go away with a resolution of the trauma. But it's getting that emotion kind of back where it belongs. But why am I so angry? If you remember my groups, what fuels anger and rage? Shame and guilt all the time. Shame and guilt. So if shame and guilt is the culprit, it may be shame over something you shouldn't be, you don't need to be ashamed of, but you believe you do. Guilt over something. That's okay to feel guilty sometimes, but if you don't process it, if you don't deal with it, that will fuel those kind of outbursts when trauma isn't resolved.
So this doesn't have to be a part of the podcast. I'm generally curious. So so we're often told that when you start abusing drugs and alcohol, your frontal lobe stops developing or is put on pause to a certain extent.
Okay.
So that
What's your question?
so that coupled with the emotional pause from the trauma. So basically, I guess my question is,
Okay, so you're basically go ahead.
yeah, so trauma happens when I'm 6. It goes unresolved. 15, 16, 17 years old, I start drinking. As time goes on, I'm still not seeking resolution. My life is chaotic. I turn to harder drugs, whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter, but either way. So, like, where does that have any significance at all? The trauma happened when I'm 6. You've removed I then decide to go to treatment. You've removed the drugs and alcohol from my body. Where am I emotionally? Like, what am I still at?
Emotionally, you're the age we talked about if you've had a trauma.
Okay,
You're still that age.
right.
But in being sober and nothing triggering you emotionally, you're still a 35-year-old and walking around and doing things. But you've seen older people that are pretty quick at the draw with anger, right? Or aggression or get insulted so quick, right? Think about whatever age you see, think about what age that looks like. Meaning, what does a 5-year-old do when they don't get their how old's your child? 3. What does your 3-year-old do when she don't get her way?
He throws a fit.
What does that fit look like?
Temper tantrum,
Flopping around,
flailing
right?
arms, all that.
Okay. Fast forward that 25 years and they don't get what they want, it looks like that. If you're 12, it's going to look a little, if you're 12, or let's say 14, 15, you're a teenager, what might that tantrum look like?
Hitting stuff, throwing stuff, breaking stuff,
Right,
fisticuffs, all
right.
that. Yeah.
So what you've described and what I should have said is basically that's what I used to tell the clients at the center. I'll know where you're stuck. All I have to do is watch you in the med line when the nurse says you can't have something. And you start flopping around on the floor. Everyone in the group laughs because they know exactly what I'm talking about. The way you're flopping around or yelling or bravado, bullying tells me where you're stuck emotionally. But now you didn't ask the $1,000,000 question. Are you stuck there forever? People want to know that. No. Back to the story. The 6.5-year-old. Okay. It took me about a year. I started observing, watching what happens. And then I realized how trauma operates with children. It's a little different, but you carry it into adulthood. She's trying to change the ending of what happened to her. Well, with a 6-year-old, I can do that. With you, I can't. You're too smart now. So, but with a 6-year-old, all I had to do was put myself in her world, change the ending with comfort, soothing her, and her needs being met. Guess what? It took about a month or two for her to catch up. 5 years emotionally. Suddenly, she's a 6.5-year old. A couple of months later, and that's when I've seen it with adults. No different. There's no that if you want to use your brain example, it's a good one because your impulse area of the brain is like a nut, size of a nut. Your cognitive functioning is so much bigger, but yet we let that little impulse part drive until this one takes over. Well, getting you unstuck and this one taking over, emotionally, you will catch up. So you're not doomed because an event happened at 12 and you're never going to, that Vinny's saying, I'm stuck emotionally forever at 12. No. But a good telltale sign of me knowing if you resolved your trauma, if I can watch you for a little while when you get angry, you won't resort back to that age no more. You will actually shift gears, change. And it's going to shock you just as much as it may shock the people around you. So trauma resolution is just that a knot in your stomach that just seems to never go away when you're wrestling, when you're going back, when you're living in the past most of the present, and then suddenly that's gone. But the love thing can suddenly make that not think it's gone. But if you, so I always write about this, as long as you know there's a reason for the not to be gone other than I'm in love, or other than I got a new job, or other than, hey, I moved to a new place, because these are what things people do, and I see on the timelines, and they think they've solved their problem. Well, guess what? The shadow follows you. Your shadow will follow you wherever you go. So you can't run away from it, but you'll feel like it's resolved until your patterns and trends start again in that new world. And then you're right back to where you started. So there's kind of curveball that I say. You need to be able to know inside. Suddenly you feel better. Well, Travis, did you read a book? Did you read a couple of books? Travis, did you go for therapy? Yeah. Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe it's working. It seems to be working. I read some books, I'm taking some classes. I'm feeling better about myself. In other words, there's a reason you're finding that peace. It's not just I'm at peace because I fell in love. No, that's a dangerous. I hate that one because I see too many people 10, 20 years later. And it's tragic because then they feel like what? Not only did they feel like and they'll use this word, I don't use it, wasted the first 6, 7 years, then they feel like they've wasted 23 more years. And that now you're dealing with more trauma and more shame and guilt. And you see how this cycle goes.
So a common phrase in treatment centers is change your people, places, and things. That's not nearly as important as seeking the resolution.
And if you ask me, yes. I mean, the old school unfortunately, I'm pretty old. Back in the late 60s, the only treatment for substance was you went away, never go back to your neighborhood. That was the mantra. Never go back. Never. You go back, you're going to use again. So again, it was all about, well, we teach you how not to use drugs and alcohol, but what we're not doing is repairing the mental health component, the trauma maybe from the neighborhood, the trauma from your upbringing. So of course you can't go back, but you can go back. I think I disagree. If you do the work, you can go back because the drugs and alcohol no longer play that role in your life. Now, we're not talking disease model versus I wrote that blog is also there, symptom or disease. That's another podcast that we will do. But you see what I'm saying? So I think there's something to all those things, but the moving, yeah, I get what you mean. They'll say move or change your job or change your location. Well, that's fine. Maybe to find you're not happy in your work, get another job where you're happy. But don't just do it based on the fact Your life's a mess right now, so let's start over. You're going to do the same things you did to make it the situation you were in.
Well, and it's a whole picture too, right? Like if I seek resolution for my trauma, that alone is not going to teach me how to communicate effectively, right? So like my emotional maturity might have reached the point that my current age, but yet I still have not gained the skills and how. So basically the reason why I'm bringing this up is a lot of people I think will interpret this as I don't need treatment apart from trauma therapy. So but that's not what you're saying at all. You're saying like the 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 trauma resolution will get you to, it's basically priming your brain to be able to have no longer have band-aids, but to have forever solutions to build upon, and it's not just one thing.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's ideal. I'm creating a world that will take you to your death to be able to achieve. It's a lifelong journey. But you're saying it where I'll say it even simpler. I tell people, get a piece of paper, put a line down the middle, put unresolved issues on your left, resolved issues on your right. When the unresolved all go over to the right, that should be contentment. Now, of course, again, things happen. I can't change that, but I can change the way you view it. That is causing your symptoms, your unrest. It's not the fact an event happens as much as the way you now view that event. So, yes, the healthier I get you from therapy, from reading, from education, the healthier I get you and the more comfortable you are in your skin. And the more then alone time, which terrified you before, now you welcome because it's a great time for you to process the day's events. These are wonderful paths and places to reach. The rest takes care of itself. Now, I hear what you're saying because then, if it's substance abuse involved, well, does that mean, hey, wait, now is Vinny saying once I resolve my trauma, I can go have a drink? No, Vinny's not saying that. Vinny don't know yet if your drinking is from an unresolved trauma and to deal with your symptoms or the disease model, which I do believe exists. So how do you know to sort them out? That's another podcast that I wrote the blog on, disease or symptom relief. Not symptom, it's symptom relief. Which one? Well, you'll never know if it's the disease if you can't resolve what you can resolve, the mental part, the processing part. So if you now feel better about who you are and what you are, you still might crave a drink. Yeah, you shouldn't be drinking. In my case, the better I felt, the less I wanted to get high or drink. Because now it messes with the mind that I like when I'm alone now, instead of it tormenting me and the alcohol and drugs need it to put it out. Does that kind of make a
100
little bit of sense?
100%.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to get my brain the way it is now, and I don't want anything to mess with that.
Right. Why would you want to? If you feel pretty comfortable, see, then okay, and there's no external force that put you in that other than internally feeling that. That's the big difference. And that's the hard part for, I think, people, because a lot of external band aids get healthy grounds. I call them person, places, or things can be put in place and make you think you've resolved your pasts.
Well, a lot of times people think that if I just waited it out, it'll go away at some point.
Yes. I've had many people say, well, yeah, that was 20 years ago. It has nothing to do with me now. Oh, okay. Well, you're here. When I'm at a treatment center, it's easy. I say, well, I don't know if it had something to do with you being here or not, but I sure know you didn't plan on being in rehab 5 years from now. 5 years ago, did you plan on? I think in 5 years, I'm going to go to rehab. Nobody does that. So it's not working, whatever you're doing.
Okay.
Thank you, Travis. I think we covered today what trauma resolution looks like. Last time, what is a traumatic event? In the next podcast, I'd like to cover anger. Anyone wanting to look ahead, you can look in the description below. Go over to the podcast. I do have a 3-part series on anger and would like to cover that more in depth on the next podcast. Thank you all.